Welcome to Work from the Inside Out, a podcast that highlights real-life stories, practical strategies, and best practices for transitioning your career from unhappiness and dissatisfaction to fulfillment, meaning, and joy. Now here is your host, career and executive coach, Tammy Guler-Loeb.
Hey everyone, I am delighted to introduce today's guest, Alain Hunkins. Alain helps leaders, teams, and companies achieve performance goals easier. Over his 25-year career, Alain has worked with over 3,000 groups of leaders in 27 countries, including 42 of the Fortune 100 companies. In addition to being an executive coach, leadership and team development facilitator, and keynote speaker, Alain is the author of the book, Cracking the Leadership Code: 3 Secrets to Building Strong Leaders. Alain is a faculty member of Duke Corporate Education and serves on the academic board of advisors for the New Delhi Institute of Management. Alain's work has been featured in Chief Executive, Fast Company, Inc., Training Magazine, Chief Learning Officer, and Business Insider. He's also a monthly leadership strategy contributor to Forbes magazine. Alain was recently named number 33 on the global power list of the top 200 biggest voices in leadership for 2023 by Leaders Hum. A father of 2 teenagers, he lives in Northampton, Massachusetts. Please join me in welcoming Alain Hunkins. Welcome.
Thank you, Tammy. I'm so excited to be here with you today. Thank you so much.
I am too. I am really delighted to have you here. Thank you for being here. So, Alain, as you know, on Work from the Inside Out, we love to begin at the beginning. So, take us back to those formative years. How did they lead you to being all that you are today?
Yeah, I love the premise of your podcast and the idea, because it all starts from the beginning. And there's a reason that they call them the formative years, because they shape so much of our worldview. And so for me, it's funny because at the time, you don't realize how formative these formative years necessarily are.
Right.
So for me, in looking back, and this is the benefit of a little bit of age and wisdom, hopefully, is that as I look back in my life, I look at a couple of unique situations that I was in. And actually, I write about this in my book as well, because it kind of is what has really motivated me throughout everything in my life. So I was raised in New York City. That's not particularly unique. I was raised by a single mom and my grandmother, also not necessarily particularly unique. The part where it starts to get a bit unique is the fact that my grandmother and my mother are both survivors of the Holocaust. So my mother's born in Belgium in 1935. And so when she's about 6.5, 7 years old, the Nazis invade Belgium. My mother spends from the time she's 7 until she's 10 separated from her mother and in hiding. And amazingly, she survived the war. My grandmother, who was actually arrested and brought to a concentration camp, was liberated. They both survived, which is pretty amazing considering the odds. And they were reunited. Turns out these 2 people became my primary parents. And anyone that knows anything about trauma knows that trauma informs people, and there's multi-generational trauma. And so I share all this because what I noticed growing up at the time was that we can say the organizational environment of my family, the culture, was very different than it was when I was at friends' houses. It was very different than I was at school. In fact, I loved going to school because school felt so much lighter. My house is, remember that Snoopy cartoon with the character like always has the rain cloud over their head?
Yeah.
That's kind of what my family felt like, And again, no blame, no shame. It's just like that's the experience they had. And I'm not here to I'm this. No, this is, so there were a lot of, believe it or not, gifts came out of that experience. And some of those gifts were realizing I had 2 basically post-traumatic stress disordered people, and me being the younger sibling, as younger siblings often are, they're hypersensitive to how is this environment working. And so it, for me, had me start to really attune my sensitivity antenna to other people. So you might want to call that emotional intelligence, people skills. I started to have to realize how do I navigate and negotiate this worldview of where I am? And it turns out that I was lifting some pretty heavy weights at a very young age, which means that I got really good at being able to deal with lots of different types of people and lots of different situations with all levels of emotional intensity or lack thereof. And so for me, that's what really got me interested in people. And I think also what I was really curious about coming up was like seeing my mother and my grandmother and seeing how they responded to the after effects of their experience is one way.
Yeah.
And then I must have been maybe 17 or 18 years old when I first picked up a copy of Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, right? Famous book. For those that don't know it, go out and read it. Run, don't walk. It's an amazing, it's voted one of the top most influential books of the 20th century. But, Frankl was this psychiatrist who was in practice and then was arrested and imprisoned in concentration camps. And just shares, and one of my favorite quotes from him is this one. He says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is your power to choose. And in that choice lies your freedom. And so if I look at what I've done in my work around people is realizing that if you want to grow what I call your leadership capacity, you could also call it your human agency capacity, because it's really the same thing. But if you want to grow that capacity, you need to realize that you have the power to make choices that can serve you and be in alignment with your purpose and in accordance with what your values are. And so for whatever reasons, I was gifted with a lot of insight at a very young age. If you talk to people, oh, that kid, Alain, with the funny name, he's an old soul. I mean, I just was like, I was thinking about these very deep thoughts because it was very clear, that life and death was something that we're all a part of. And it wasn't necessarily talked about, but that was kind of through osmosis. I picked up a lot of that. And so that led me to studying psychology and theater when I was an undergrad. I ended up going, unusual thing to end up working in organizations, but I actually went on and got a Master's of Fine Arts from a professional theater training program. So I studied being an actor, which in some ways is really dissecting what is human behavior all about, where literally you change your physical posture, you change your voice to inhabit other people's personas. I mean, there's a whole skill to that. And I learned a ton. And talk about empathy. You're literally trying to step into someone else's shoes and be that person. And so I found that was all wonderful fodder and compost to kind of build on as I think about what ultimately led me to really being someone, and I, a number of years ago, I went on this amazing, dynamic, transformational, experiential weekend that I came away from it with a sense of what my personal mission was, right? And I think your work from the inside out is if you want to live a life where you're living from the inside out, you have to live on purpose. Yes. And so for me, living on purpose means you have to know what is your purpose? What is your mission?
That helps, right?
Because it's kind of hard to do it if you don't know what it is. And so for me, at the age of 27, I went off on this training weekend. And through the weekend, we were given a chance to look at what our own personal life mission was. And that for me was 1994. So that we're looking at that being 26 years ago. And amazingly, my mission, my purpose has not changed, which means I must have been pretty on point with, I got a lot, some people's missions, purposes change over time. Mine has been pretty consistent, which is my mission is to create a vibrant and alive world by kindling the fire of brilliance in people.
Wow. So at 27, you came up with that, and that has continued to carry you. I love it. At that point, at 27, were you on a trajectory towards an acting career? Or
I was on a trajectory towards an acting career, and I was already having doubts about the profession, right?
Because of what? I'm curious.
I think I was having doubts about the profession because I grew up with a lot of fear and anxiety around me, right? So I internalized. So I was in a 3-year acting program, and most of my classmates were like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go for it. Whereas I was already imagining damage control. I was like, well, there's very few actors who get jobs, and is this a realistic thing? And I was already thinking about all the what ifs and how this wasn't going to work, which is not a really good way. It's like trying to drive a car with one foot on the gas, one foot on the brake. It's not a very comfortable ride. So I think for me, what I was already questioning, like, is this what I want to do? Is this going to be hard? And I didn't have a whole lot of role models of people who were like super positive in my corner and like,
Yeah.
like you can do whatever you want if you set your mind to it. I mean, I might have been told that by a couple teachers, but I didn't really have a real strong mentor. And
Yeah.
if you don't have that, I think viscerally in your bones, you got to do a lot of work to get there,
So yeah, well, I'm hearing that and I'm thinking, so in a way, even going for the MFA program in and of itself was kind of a big deal then, because like,
oh yeah.
What were you going and doing that for?
Oh, completely. I mean, in fact, it's funny because I was a really good student in high school. I went to a very good college. And I think my mother and my grandmother, like, I was a good, like, why aren't you going to, again, at the time, why aren't you going to become a lawyer or a doctor? Like, you should be doing that. Like, what, an actor? Like, what do you, there wasn't like a, great, make that work. I mean, there was more like, what are you thinking? What? Yeah. So there was definitely some seeds of doubt around me too.
Yeah, but they didn't try to stop you then.
They didn't try to stop me necessarily.
Yeah,
they didn't try to stop me from that.
It's interesting because I have roots in the same area, New York, and a lot of these. I mean, if you're not going to be a lawyer or a doctor, what? Like, why?
Yeah, right? Yeah, very much.
But that's interesting that you pushed through that, and then you went and you did this weekend. Was that connected to your program in any way, or
was connected in that one of my classmates had done the same weekend 2 years earlier, and he had mentioned it to me, and it was basically it was a weekend that it's through a men's organization. It's actually called the Mankind Project. Because the idea was started by these three men. I won't go into the full story of this, but basically, it was the idea is that men need to be initiated into a form of mature masculinity. Because if you look around our society, and I think it's still true, you have a lot of people who become by chronological age, 20s, 30s, and 40s, they should be adult men. You still have a lot of little boys just becoming big boys, just acting out in bigger boy ways. Right. So their whole idea was, guess what? Men need to be emotionally intelligent. They have to realize that you can be strong and sensitive, right? Is that you can be powerful and also be very pro women. Like as opposed to like these very two-dimensional concepts that I think, particularly in the mid 20th century, a lot of guys had grown up with. And so for me, seeing my classmate, and here I am 25, 26, 27 years old, I'm like, by the clock, I should feel like I'm a grown up, but how come I'm not there yet? And so it was actually seeing the changes in him over the couple of years. I went, I need, it's like that line in Harry Met Sally, I'll have what she's having.
Right.
It's kind of like that. Right. Yeah. Like so he was the one who turned me on to the weekend, and it really was incredibly transformational.
It sounds like you got so much out of it. And so out of that weekend, it sounds like, I mean, clearly not one weekend transforms a whole human being, but it was definitely significant. So you found your purpose. It's pretty much stayed with you. But clearly, there are a number of different ways in which you have lived out that purpose over the years. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think for me, one of the things that coming off of this weekend with this organization was they recognized that one weekend does not change everything. It's kind of like you come off with a weekend warrior high. Yay. So what they have is actually, they call them integration groups. So these ongoing groups that meet weekly. And to kind of help to integrate the tools that you start to learn on the weekend, which is great. So I got involved with those integration groups, and very quickly, I was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for grad school. I moved back to New York, and I very quickly said, I want to be more involved with this work. So I was the junior facilitator for some of these integration groups, so these groups. And it was interesting because most of the men at the time who went through these trainings used to kind of gravitate more demographic, kind of midlife crisis, like mid 40s kind of people. And so I was very, very young, relatively speaking. And I remember I was with one of these groups, and by the third week, the senior facilitator dropped out. And so I was the junior facilitator, like, okay, let's make this work. And I'm looking at the protocols and what we're doing. I'm basically one page ahead of where we are. But I loved it. And I also found I was really pretty good at the skills of part of it is creating a safe space, a safe container, and then really
Wow.
listening to people. And so this is where I began to grow my skills as a facilitator.
Yeah.
And also because I had been around so much emotional intensity in my home life,
Yeah.
nothing could shake me. Like I was pretty unshakable. It's like you would bring up like welcome to the human race. Like nothing
Yeah,
surprises
really.
me. Like nothing surprises me at this point. And so that's how I got involved with that work. And then I ended up getting involved doing educational training. I was working in schools using arts and education. And so I was
Oh,
working in high schools. I mean, I was working with a company. We had a residency at Rikers Island. So I was working with inmates, both there's a whole juvenile group as well as some adult men as well. We were working with, we worked at drug rehab centers, and I cut my teeth teaching in some pretty challenging situations with some amazing mentors. And then a
wow.
couple of years into all this, a colleague that I had met through this men's organization, I was doing a facilitation training. He said, "Have you ever thought about working in organizations like corporations?" Business, because again, that was not my thing really. Yeah, and just kind of a side note, my dad and my stepmom, my dad was a jazz pianist and my
Ah,
stepmom was an actress and a director, and they were both kind of hippies-ish type people generally. And kind of growing up like corporations are the man, they're evil. Like, yeah, so that was not my thing. But so I ended up getting, I'll skip the middle part of the story, but basically through this guy, I ended up going to a local chapter meeting of what at the time was called the American Society of Training Development, which is now
oh, yeah.
ATD. So
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
now the Association for Talent Development. I went to
Right.
a local meeting, and on the way out, I picked up a job. I picked up their newsletter, and I read through their job hotline, and I applied, and I ended up getting a job working for a training company that
Ah,
did leadership and management training with Fortune 500 type companies. And
wow.
that was 1997. That was kind of my intro into kind of the business world. And what I found was, surprise, surprise, business people, the operative word is people. They're people. They think like the rest of the humanity. They're not that different. And you can learn about them if you ask great open-ended questions and then shut up and listen to them.
Wow. And if you could just take that, put it in a bottle and sell it, we'd all be better off, I think.
In what way?
Because I think enough of us don't ask questions and just stop and listen.
No, it's so true. I mean, I really feel like I've got a real. I never got an MBA, but I feel like I've got a real world MBA by just asking people questions, including things like, "I'm sorry, that acronym. Oh, what does that mean?" People are
Yeah.
happy to explain.
Yeah.
But I think one of the challenges I think that so many of us have is that ego. Like, if I ask that question, am I going to look stupid or that?
Right.
Ask the
Right.
question. Just ask the
Instead
question.
of looking like, oh, I'm being real, because
Yeah.
the people in the room want to ask that question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Love it. So from from, over a 3-year period, you moved from your the men's group and finishing the MFA and doing the education work in the arts to corporate America.
Yeah, it was really quick, right? If you're looking
It's
back on it,
very
it was like
quick.
3 years, like quite a journey and a shift. And it's funny because at the time that I started doing the work in corporate America, that year I had actually applied and was accepted to the Hunter College School of Social Work. I was about to start an MSW because I had gotten involved. Like, maybe I'll become a therapist. I thought I'd become a psychotherapist. And what ended up happening is I got this job and I thought, okay, well, I can always go back to school. So we'll put the schooling on hold. And so that was 27 years ago now. So
So you're
anyway,
still thinking about it,
I
or
don't think about going back. I don't think so. No, it's interesting because I do a lot of coaching and I've been certified as a coach, which to me feels more up my alley than being a therapist at this point.
yeah,
And though it's interesting because as a coach, probably more than most coaches, I'm pretty comfortable when we get into some areas that some other coaches might be like, oh, I think we need a therapist now. I mean, my bandwidth for being able to hold some deeper levels of emotion is probably more than most coaches just because
right,
of my background. And also I've been involved with facilitating these men's groups for 25 years too.
right,
So,
right. Oh, so you're still doing that work?
yeah, I'm still involved with that work.
Wow, that's great. So take us forward then. So you started, you started to dip a toe in the corporate waters around, it sounds like about 30 years old.
Yeah, about 30.
And then So the MSW was off the table at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
What kinds of decisions were you making from there for yourself?
Well, it was interesting, right? So as I was moving forward, I mean, one of the things is when I got involved with, at this point in my life, this is where like my voracious learner really kicked in because I
Oh,
felt like the more that I learned, and I would meet, colleagues and they'd say, "Oh, do you know this model or this person's thinking?" I'm like, "No, I don't. You should read this book." Okay. And so I started reading all this stuff and I started recognizing how so many different people's ideas connected to each other that it wasn't just like, it was just like Stephen Covey and like the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Yes, that's one model of thinking about stuff. But then you could go to Marshall Goldsmith and what got you
right.
here won't get you there. You can start to see like how these things overlap. And so what was interesting to me was how do I synthesize and integrate all these things? And what was really the most important thing, I was working with groups is that for the most part, business people, they were less concerned with what theory or practice you were using. They were like,
Yeah.
how does it work? And what do I do? And so everything for me was how do I translate ideas into practical,
Mm.
tangible tools that you can use? And so what I found was oftentimes, and I was working and I was doing these various training programs. And anyone who works in the world of learning and development knows that oftentimes as a facilitator, you get handed a program. And I like to somewhat euphemistically say that the program is half baked, right? It's not,
Yes.
it worked for the designer, but it doesn't necessarily play in Peoria, for the
Right.
masses. And so you're constantly having to tweak and change and alter. And ultimately, you start redesigning things. And so what I found was I was pretty good at that too. And so I would start to rewrite things. And then, of course, you want to make things better. So I would start bringing in more and more of my own content of like, here's this. And the other thing was, and I was always interested in writing. And
Oh,
I had been writing off and on here and there. And then at one point, probably about 10 years into the whole training thing, at this point also, I had left my one company that I'd been working full time for, and I started freelancing. I started working for a bunch of different training companies.
uh-huh.
And guess what? They all had different models, and I learned different things from different people, but it expanded my own worldview. And I had this mentor around writing, and he said, "Hey, Alain, can I offer you a word of wisdom?" He said, "In fact, 2 words of wisdom." I said, "Yeah, what?" He said, "I got this from my mentor about writing. Writers write." That was his advice. Writers write. So what I mean by that is you say you want to write a book. A book is kind of like saying, I'm sitting on the couch all week. I'm ready to run a marathon. Like you don't start with a marathon. You start with like maybe putting your shoes on and going for a walk around the block.
Right.
So he said, a book's a tall order. He said, do you think you could write a blog? And I said, yeah, I think so. He said, how many words do you think you could write? That's how often? And I said, you'd probably do like 350 words a week. Would that be easy? I was like, 350 words, sure. He said, great. Why don't you start with that? So, and if you go to my website, you'll see I actually have all the blogs from the beginning, and some of them are so bad, but they're there just to show you progress can happen.
I
So
love
I
that.
started blogging, and so I started blogging, and I started for whatever reason I published my blogs every Saturday, and it wasn't about how many followers do I have and how many likes. It was really about honing my writing muscle. And it's having also having to come up with ideas. And I was out working with clients all the time, and they had ideas, like they were telling stories, and that would be the birth, a seed of an idea for a blog. And so I did not miss publishing on a Saturday for over 4 years, where
Mm.
I was just stuck to it, right? So over time, so after 4 years, I've got 250 or so blog posts, and believe it or not, that I ended up going back through all those blog posts, and I started looking for common themes. What were some of the
Mm.
big themes that showed up? What were some of the things? And what I found was I was writing a lot about leaders because I was doing
Uh,
management and leadership training. So leadership sort of became the umbrella. And as I looked under the umbrella, what I saw were these 3 themes that kept emerging over and over again. One theme was around connection. Is that one thing that great leaders do is they connect human to human because you're all doesn't matter what industry you're in the human being business. That's all first and foremost. The first theme was connection. The second theme was around communication. Is it seemed that communicating well or communicating poorly, do we reach understanding? Are we stuck in misunderstanding? That was another huge theme. And the third theme was around collaboration. What are we doing to create environments where people can work at their best? So bring a lot of things around the science of high performance. And so connection, communication, and collaboration became what now is, with this book that I wrote, Cracking the Leadership Code. The subtitle is The Three Secrets to Building Strong Leaders. And those three secrets are connection, communication, and collaboration. All of which to say is that all came out of 350 words a week, and then when the book, I ended up working with an editor and then got an agent, and was happy in 2019, Wiley picked it up and they published the book in 2020.
Wow. So, that's a lovely story. I love that. And it makes a ton of sense. So from there, so you wrote the book while you were still training and drawing from all those experiences. And the book is based on those blogs. Was there anything else you drew from to build the book?
Yeah, the book, definitely was influenced by some people who really shaped some of my thinking. And there's probably two authors, or two sets of authors, two co-authors that really influenced me. I don't know if you're familiar with Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so they wrote the Leadership Challenge, which I think they just published their 7th edition. And for those that aren't familiar with it, they're great, and they were great. Yeah. They both endorsed the book, which was, I felt so. I was listening to hear a couple of my idolized mentors, right, from afar. And what I love about the Leadership Challenge is they democratized leadership, right? So for a long time, leadership was thought of like it's on this rarefied pedestal. And what they said is, no, actually, leadership is a series of behaviors that can be learned. Like, do you model the way? Do you lead by example? Do you challenge the process? Do you encourage the heart? So they have wonderful examples of ordinary people who do extraordinary things by living these things out. So they definitely informed a lot of my thinking around stuff. And then the other person who really informs my thinking is Dan Pink. And so, Dan Pink's such a good writer, and particularly his thinking about how the world has shifted in his book, Free Agent Nation, how things are, and Whole New Mind, and how it really informed my thinking on how the world, society at large, there's some societal forces that have changed, that have forced organizations to change, which means leaders have changed. So if you kind of map that out step by step, but it starts with society. And for example, one of the big things that changed, look between the 1950s, let's say, and today, that's even, go back that far, but choice is just how many more choices people have today than they ever had before. And then another big factor is technology. So, it used to be, the example that he gives in one of his books too, is, if you wanted to buy a used car, you would have to go from car lot to car lot, and you didn't know how good that car was or not. And so we calls it asymmetrical information. The fact is, the used car dealer had information that you didn't have, and you were at a disadvantage. Well, in today's world, with things like obviously the internet, and then all the websites like whatever CarMax or whatever, there's a million car websites. Right. Is your access to information, and that suddenly levels the playing field, in terms of information, and we can make better decisions. And so recognizing, back in the day, there was no LinkedIn, there was no Glassdoor. People didn't know where the grass was greener, and you sort of felt a bit more stuck where you were. Whereas today, it's like, this isn't working out. Guess what? There's 8 other people who want me. I'm out of here. So the idea of a mobile workforce, and this is pre-pandemic, this is what we call the Great Resignation. So looking at how these different things play out, there's been some seismic shifts that have really played out. And frankly, the pandemic and coronavirus it just accelerated everything that was already happening in terms of this kind of the splintering. It just magnified it completely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I was curious, I was going to ask you about that, because from the point of view of like leaders and executives that you're working with, mm-hmm. in some ways, and I work with executives as well, it seems like some of them are feeling almost blindsided by the last few years. Like, even though what you're saying is that it's actually been, in a way, a natural evolution, given all the developments that have occurred over the years with our access to information increasing. It does feel like people who are trying to lead organizations are really taking a look around now that we're 3 years out from the beginning, or what we think was the beginning of the pandemic, and saying, this is not the way I thought I was going to be leading. I'm not even sure what I'm leading now, because everybody's just deciding whatever the heck they want to do. And I'm having these conversations constantly with people. So what kinds of things are you encountering with that, and how does your work connect with that, or how are you helping people with that?
Great question, Tammy. And I'm having very similar conversations with the people that I work with. It's interesting. I was down in Palm Springs a couple of weeks ago working with about 60 CEOs, both from the software and manufacturing industries. And like just about every industry, people are struggling with these same questions. Wait, this isn't what I thought I was signing up for.
Yeah.
Like, well, guess what? What you signed up, that's not the world that you live in now. It's like, this is a different world. And one of the things I try to, when I'm coaching executives and other leaders, is to help them recognize at the end of the day, leadership is not a title. It's not position, it's power. Leadership at its core is a relationship between two people, between the person who wants to lead and the person who chooses to follow. And I use that word chooses very intentionally, because we're living in a world where we don't expect compliance, right? It's not like to do your job because I say so. We live in this knowledge work age where we don't just need people to show up and just do like modern times, Charlie Chaplin on the assembly line, like the widget is repetitive. It's not a repetitive industrial age job. We actually need people to show up with their brains and be creative and innovative and problem solve and notice things and speak up and have initiative. And there are certain environments where people will flourish doing that kind of work, and there's certain environments will shut that down. And unfortunately, too many leaders, basically, they don't know that. They're very skilled at what they do. I can be an excellent technologist, and I can build amazing hardware, software, whatever it is. But do I realize what kind of environment do people perform at their best? That's outside of I don't know. So suddenly you're saying this is and it's become that much more important now than it ever was. So what do I do? It's really just so challenging for them to see. So yeah, I saw that there. You mentioned I write for Forbes. I write a monthly strategy column for Forbes, and I got to collaborate with a woman named Kim Lone Tran, who is the VP of talent management for Allstate Insurance. And we were taking a look at what are some of the big changes that have gone on since the pandemic. We wrote this article this last year in 2022. And one of the things is that basically the social contract between employees and employers has changed.
Oh, totally.
Employees are, after they've had that pause, once, what's the old expression say? Once people have a taste of Paris, you can't put them back on the farm, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is once people have had a taste of the autonomy and the empowerment of, okay, coronavirus is here, you'll have to work from home. Guess what? I actually like this non-commuting thing. I actually like. Now, granted, I get the fact that if you work in a retail environment or you're a dog, you can't do that. But in the other places where you can, people were, oh my God. And I was like, okay, now we need you to come back to the office 3 days a week. Why? Because we're going hybrid. Again, look, because I said so, it doesn't work with kids, doesn't work with teenagers, doesn't work with employees. I think it would be much more honest if, and I've talked to many people about this, be much more honest if leaders said, hey, you know what? I need you back in the office 3 days a week. And here's why. Frankly, I have high control needs, and it just helps to stifle my anxiety. I mean, that's honest. That's honest.
Anyone who's tried that?
I don't know. I would. I mean, look, that's honest, right? I mean, look, we get the fact that we work in organizations and there's rank and hierarchy, but look, and it's funny. I also collaborated. I don't know if you're familiar with David Rock. He's the kind of
definitely,
yeah.
Sure.
So I interviewed David Rock for another. So we were talking about, if for those that you can look up, Google the SCARF model. It talks about all these different needs.
Yeah.
So we kind of looked at the pandemic and like the return to work from two lenses using his SCARF model. One is like security being. So anyway, all of what you say, but if you look at it through the eyes of the boss versus the worker, it's very different. So the fact is, for the boss, having everyone right close to hand in the office makes you feel much more autonomous, because suddenly you know what you're doing. You can go down the hall and do this. Whereas for the worker, all your autonomy is being stripped away. So it all depends on the lens you're looking at the problem through. And one of my favorite things out of that interview that we had is like, if we're asking the question, should we come back to work 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, we're asking the wrong question. The real
Right.
question should be, are we creating environments where people can be as engaged and productive as possible? And it may turn out the answers to those questions are different depending on both the team and the person. And so there's not a one size fits all cookie cutter solution.
Right. And
So,
do we even know what will engage people? Ooh, we could
yeah.
ask them.
Oh, yeah, there's a concept. Let's ask them and not have to be the answer person, the commander. Again, that's old school leadership. I have to have all the answers and tell you what to do. That is not
Right.
the world we live in anymore.
And yet it's not their fault. This is all they've ever known.
Exactly.
I think the landscape going forward is new territory for a lot of
Yeah.
leaders.
Yeah.
I don't know. It seems like it's just new, fresh territory for pretty much the whole world at this point.
Oh, it's completely is. And one of the things, I'm sure you're familiar with like Michael Bungay-Stainer and the coaching habit, and so interesting. So there's a lot of talk about we need our leaders to be coaches, like take a coach or coach-like approach. And of course, the challenge that people are like, okay, I'm going to coach my people. For most leaders, when they start off with that, what does that mean? That means that they think that they're now supposed to tell them and give them advice.
Right.
That's not coaching, folks. That's advice
That's
giving.
for football.
Yeah, it's like do this. Like again, it's not telling. And so it's really hard because there's a certain kind of humility and ego displacement that needs to happen where you realize this isn't about me, it's about them. And how can I be of service? And I have to lead by listening and really understanding them and allow them to come up with their own solutions. Like you said, that is a very different mindset and world than most of these leaders have ever dealt with before.
So bridge that with your work around the facilitative mindset, because it sounds like that's really one good pathway to be looking at then.
No, thanks. Yeah, for sure. So I like to call what we're doing here is the facilitative mindset. And I love the word facilitate comes from the same word as facile, which means easy. Like Latin root is facile. The fact is, we all know what VUCA is, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So we live in this very complex, difficult challenge. What people really want leaders to do is make things easier, right? How can we have someone, please, thank you, make this easier for me? And so a big part of making things easier is recognizing we're not suddenly trying to come up with what the answer is, but instead allow people to find out what their answer is and then share that across purposes by how are we going to communicate that and create environments where people are sharing information. So we have a better data set to pull from and come up with better solutions and make better choices and get better results. Yeah. And so for me, the facilitative mindset, surprise, surprise, it comes back to these 3 meta skills. It starts, if you want to create a facilitative mindset, you have to first of all have connect with human beings. And the core of connection is empathy, is you have to see people first and foremost as human beings, as opposed to employee title, box in the org chart. So getting to know people, because that is going to engender trust. That's going to create psychological safety. That is going to speed up their ability to share information back and forth. It's going to enable you to create more innovative climates, et cetera. So much of that has to do with connection. Yeah. Then what are we doing to ensure that we're creating the kind of communication that ends up with a solid mutual shared understanding, right? And the reason that we need understanding is because understanding is the platform on which we're going to take all future action. So if we have a solid foundation of understanding, we can make great decisions. We're going to get really good results. If our foundation for understanding is tippy and wobbly, we're going to make some poor decisions. We're going to end up with some poor results.
Right.
And then the third piece around the facilitative mindset is the sense of collaborating. And so for me, there's 4 elements of what we need to bring in as leaders to design environments. We need to create a sense of safety, both physical and psychological safety. We have to create a sense of purpose, that people feel that what they're doing has meaning greater than themselves. They also have to feel like they can take ownership. That means that we are not micromanaging, that we're actually giving people autonomy so they can discover things for themselves. And the 4th thing is we have to create environments where people have energy, right? Mm-hmm. I'm amazed. I'm sure you've seen this too, but so much of it seems that the business world is just soul sucking, just in the way things are done, is realize that, how do you expect people to, put in 8 hours a day in an environment that is energetically draining? And so there's a lot of things that we can do to improve. Like a simple example of
Yeah.
something that you can do to help people's energy is, are you scheduling 60-minute meetings for 60 minutes? Like, it makes no sense on a human scale to schedule 60-minute meetings back to back, because no one
Right.
can go from a 9 o'clock meeting to a 10 o'clock and 10 without a break, without being able to, let alone forget your bladder for a second. I mean,
Right.
which is also true. But just thinking about how do you wrap your head around, like, you just need a moment to refocus. You just come, I mean, it works for the technology, right? We can schedule it in Outlook, but it doesn't work for humans. One of the things I like to say around technology is a great servant, but it's a lousy master. So we have to so anyway, that is all some of the basis. And in my work, I really work with some of like the practical, tactical things, like don't schedule your meetings for 60 minutes. That is something that makes a difference. Every little thing that we do as leaders makes a difference, for better or worse. So be intentional about the difference that you're making.
Wow. Well, I part of me, I feel like I'm like going to say amen now or something. I'm just,
Amen.
This is great. So, Alain, tell me, or tell our audience, what's the best way for people to find out more about what you're up to these days?
Yeah, probably the best place to go to is connect with me on LinkedIn. Don't just follow me, because I got a lot of followers, but connect with me on LinkedIn. The other thing, connect with me on LinkedIn. The other thing you can do, because you've listened this far, you are now part of that end of the podcast club. If anything has come up and resonates for you, you can email me directly at my email, which is Alain, ALAIN, at Alain, ALAIN, Hunkins, HUNKINS.com.
Wow.
And that's also my website. I have got various events going on. In fact, one of the things I wanted to mention to your listeners is I do have twice a year, depending on when you're listening to this, usually once in the fall, once in the spring, I run an online gamified 30-day leadership challenge with a cohort from people from literally around the world. And what we do is we work together in just about 5 to 10 minutes a day. You practice very tactically the skills of becoming a better connector, a better communicator, and a better collaborator. And if you reach out to me and email me, I do have some discount codes. I can actually get you a discounted rate off of that. But email me if you're interested in that. Be happy to share that information with you.
Fantastic. Now, this episode is going to air on March 15th.
Perfect, because the next cohort that we're starting is on May the 15th. So that's May the 15th of 2023. And we've got, and it's super exciting. I'm thrilled. We do some metrics around this. We've measured about like 22% behavioral increase changes across like a host of dimensions in just 30 days, which is unheard of. So it's great. I love it. And anyway, if you're interested in it, email me and I'll be happy to send some information.
And we will make sure that all of this information goes into the show notes and across social media once the episode goes out. So that's very generous of you. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And also, if you're interested in what we've talked about too, please pick up my book. It really distills down 20 years of wisdom into,
needless to say.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, I'm already making a list of people I'm going to gift it to. So,
thanks.
So now one final question before we wrap up. So as you know, we like to talk about the kinds of, moves and changes that people do make to find, their work from the inside out. And you certainly talked about all the moves that you've made. And what would you say is a key piece of advice that you might give somebody who is at that point where they're trying to decide or consider what their next move might be?
The words that come to mind immediately: don't go it alone, right? Don't go it alone. I think so many, U.S. culture, like, I got to figure this out for myself. Man, that's a lot of pressure to put on yourself. So reach out, ask for help, put up some test balloons, try things, ask people questions, ask more people questions. Listen to your gut, but don't think you got to figure this out on your own. And also know it's a work in progress, right? It isn't the decision. It's a decision.
That's right.
A decision, not the end all be all.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. This was absolutely delightful. And I am so excited to put this episode out.
Thanks, Tammy. It's super. I'm super excited too. It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Alain Hunkins. It was so interesting to speak with him and learn about his early life, background, and professional transitions. What is your key takeaway from our interview? If you are interested in any of the resources mentioned in today's podcast, you can find them in the show notes on my website at tammygulerloeb.com/podcast. Just look for episode 217. Are you anticipating your next professional move? Check out my award-winning book, Work from the Inside Out, Break Through 9 Common Obstacles and Design a Career That Fulfills You. It's available through my website, Amazon Worldwide, Barnes & Noble, independent bookstores, or through your local library. If you were inspired by this episode with Alain, please share it with your friends and colleagues, and please do subscribe so you don't miss next week's show. Remember, subscribing is always free. Are you enjoying the podcast? I'd be ever so grateful if you would write a review on Apple Podcasts. It's easy to find. Just go to my website, tammygulerloeb.com/podcast. Click on the Apple Podcast button and follow the instructions provided there. You can also help sustain this podcast by buying me a cup of coffee. Just go to buymeacupofcoffee.com/TammyGL. Since this podcast is self-funded, I would so appreciate your support. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's never too late or too impossible to increase your sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in your work and other meaningful activities. Let me know how it's going for you. I'd love to hear from you. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Work from the Inside Out podcast. For more information, you can find us at www.workfromtheinsideout.com.